Okay, picture this. It's 1945. The deadliest, most destructive war in all of human history is finally grinding to a halt. But this final, brutal chapter of World War II, well, it wasn't just about ending the fighting. The way the victory was won actually planted the seeds for a totally new kind of global conflict, one that would end up defining the next 50 years. The most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the most useful. Those are the words of a man grappling with a power unlike anything the world had ever seen. When President Harry Truman wrote that in his diary, he was literally weighing the fate of millions. This single sentence just perfectly captures the huge paradox of the atomic age, a weapon of unthinkable destruction that he hoped could somehow be a tool for peace. It's a contradiction that would haunt the post-war world. And that really gets us to the heart of what we're talking about today. We tend to think of the end of World War II as this neat, tidy conclusion. But what if it wasn't? What if it was really a turning point? How did the very weapon that brought about victory completely redraw the map of global power and kickstart a brand new kind of war, a Cold War? So to really get this, we're going to start with the unthinkable weapon itself. Then we'll watch the final collapse of Nazi Germany and dive into the horrific end of the war in the Pacific. And after that, we'll see how the victory itself actually fractured the winning alliance, leading straight to the descent of that infamous Iron Curtain. All right, so our story kicks off not on some battlefield, but in the labs and minds of scientists. A top-secret project, totally shrouded in secrecy, was about to drop an impossible choice right into the lap of a brand new American president. Just try to imagine this for a second. It's April 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president who'd led the country through the Depression and the war, dies. Suddenly, his vice president, Harry Truman, is the most powerful man in the world. And almost the first thing he learns about is this gigantic secret program called the Manhattan Project. For years, scientists had been in a frantic race to build an atomic bomb. And now, Truman, the new guy, had to decide what to do with it. His generals were telling him that a conventional invasion of Japan could cost a horrifying number of American lives. The other option? Unleash this new, terrifying, and totally untested weapon on the world. But before that huge decision in the Pacific could be made, the war in Europe had to be won. By 1944, the tide had completely turned against the Axis powers. Allied forces were closing in on Germany like a vice from all sides. I mean, the pressure on Germany was just relentless. It really started with the invasion of what Churchill famously called Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. Then, of course, on June 6, 1944, came D-Day, the biggest naval invasion in the history of the world. After the Allies broke out of Normandy, they faced down Germany's last desperate gamble at the Battle of the Bulge. By April of 45, it was all but over. American and Soviet troops were shaking hands at the Elbe River, literally cutting what was left of Germany in two. And what about Hitler? Deep in his bunker, with Berlin crumbling around him, he wrote his final political testament, and in it, he showed absolutely no remorse. His hateful ideology was completely unchanged. Right to the bitter end, he was blaming Jewish people for the war, telling his followers to keep up the fight. Just one day later, he killed himself. Just 7 days later, Germany officially surrendered. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, was declared. You had crowds celebrating like crazy in London, Paris, and New York. But while all that was happening, half a world away, the war was still raging, with a brutality that's hard to even imagine. You see, the war in the Pacific, it was a whole different animal. The U.S. strategy was called island hopping. This brutal, bloody, inch-by-inch campaign to capture key islands, to get closer and closer to mainland Japan. But every single island, every grain of sand, was defended with a terrifying ferocity. And if you really want to understand Truman's impossible choice, you just have to look at the fighting on two tiny islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These battles were some of the absolute bloodiest of the entire war. They were strategically crucial, yes. The Allies needed them as air bases to launch an invasion of Japan. But the cost in human lives to take them was staggering. It horrified Allied commanders. And the thinking went, if this is the price for two small islands, what on earth would be the cost of invading the entire country of Japan? So, faced with that grim calculation, Truman made his decision. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb obliterated the city of Hiroshima. Japan still didn't surrender. So 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The devastation was just absolute. Finally, on August 14th, Emperor Hirohito went on the radio and announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over. The final cost of those 6 long years of war is almost impossible to comprehend. An estimated 60 million people, soldiers and civilians, were dead. Think about that. That was about 3% of the entire world's population at the time. A global tragedy on a scale that is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. But even as the world was celebrating peace, the Grand Alliance that had won the war was already starting to fall apart. At these big post-war conferences, in places like Yalta and Potsdam, the Allies started to look a lot more like adversaries, and it became clear they each had a very, very different vision for the future. And really, the fundamental split came down to this. On one side, you had the Western powers, like the US and Britain. They were pushing for self-determination and free elections for all the countries in Europe that had been liberated. But on the other side, you had the Soviet Union, and they had been invaded by Germany twice in just 30 years. Their number one priority was security. Joseph Stalin was absolutely determined to create a buffer zone of friendly, pro-Soviet communist countries in Eastern Europe to protect his borders. These two goals, they were just completely incompatible. And Stalin himself laid it out in the bluntest terms possible at the Potsdam Conference. When President Truman pushed him on free elections, Stalin basically said, no way. He stated that any freely elected government in that region would be anti-Soviet, and that was something he simply could not allow. The lines were being drawn in the sand, right then and there. Now, one thing the Allies did agree on was the need for justice. At the Nuremberg trials, high-ranking Nazi leaders were put on trial for their horrific atrocities. And this set an incredibly important new precedent in international law, the idea that leaders could actually be held personally accountable for crimes against humanity. That fragile peace, though, it just wasn't going to last. The simmering distrust and the massive ideological conflict between the former Allies was about to harden into a new global struggle. And this new conflict got a new name: the Cold War. It wasn't a hot war with direct fighting between the US and the Soviet Union, thankfully. Instead, it was a battle of ideas, capitalism versus communism, that was fought through threats, a terrifying and escalating arms race, espionage, and wars in other countries, which we call proxy wars. In 1946, the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave this new reality a name that would stick forever. In a speech he gave in the United States, he declared that an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, separating the free, democratic West from the Soviet-controlled communist East. The metaphor was powerful, it was perfect, and it defined an era. So, when you step back and look at the big picture, the end of World War II didn't lead to a lasting peace. Instead, it created this profound and really complex new reality. It kicked off the nuclear age and a 40-year-long arms race. It physically divided Germany and the entire continent of Europe for decades. It did lead to the creation of the United Nations, an attempt to prevent this from ever happening again. And maybe most importantly, it set up a whole new world order, one dominated by two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Which really leaves us with one final big question to think about. The Berlin Wall is gone, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but are the geopolitical fault lines, the ideological tensions that were forged in the fire and ashes of World War II, are they truly a thing of the past? Or do they, in some way, continue to shape the world we're all living in today?